Welcome, everyone, to the Leading Together podcast, Insights for Delaware's Tomorrow. In each episode, we sit down with the top minds from Delaware and across the nation who share their perspectives very generously to help advance First Aid Educate's mission, which is to build capacity, raise awareness, and really elevate the roles of school board leadership across our communities. I'm Julia Kelleher. I'm your host and the Executive Director of First Aid Educate. Today's guest is Dr. James Bridgeforth. Wonderful person who I had the good fortune to meet. Really excited about this show. Have had fabulous conversations with him every time we've talked. He's an educator, a researcher, and a policy advocate. He sits. It's what's really interesting about James is he's sitting at the intersection of governance, community, and equity. He's an assistant professor of education leadership at UD. But his research examines how school boards and educational leaders are navigating politics, addressing racism, and creating space for community voices. So I just think that's fascinating because a lot of times you have sort of a researcher that's not in the field, or you have a person in the field who's not connected to research. And James is really going to bring all of that to us. Background in education, he was in higher ed admissions, then he was in a K-12 classroom, he was also a school leader, but really through and through this on-the-ground experience that's given him just a deep understanding of policy governance in real-world context, right? Like it's so exciting. He'll talk a little bit with us today about a report that he's well published, but he's got a new report that's coming out. We're going to get some advanced information on that. At this point, it will be out there, but we encourage you to go take a look. James has spent years studying and supporting school boards. He was in Los Angeles. He's been on the national stage. James, I don't want to go on forever, but I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I am so excited to be here. It's always interesting hearing introductions because, like, oh my gosh, I guess I did do all those things, but it's all really exactly what you were saying. So much of this work, it's not just about doing it just to do it. I am an academic because that's literally my job, but also that work, I care more about what happens on the ground. Like that, if all the work that we're doing, all this research, that people can actually take it and use it and do something with it meaningful for our students.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I think, we want to make it practical and have a direct impact. Could you talk just a little bit to the audience, just share a little bit about how you wound up, you're in a role now in academia as a professor, and as I said, well published, but kind of how did it all start?
It's a complicated question and a complicated answer because I don't think I ever really sought out to be in education, oddly enough. I was one of those typical liberal arts students who changed my major, I don't know how many times. It had to be at least 10 times. And eventually I settled on political science and sociology, and I was really excited about that and thought, well, at some point I really want to go to grad school. I really want to just learn more because that was just what I'd always done. And even when I was in college, I spent a lot of time doing a lot of advocacy work. I was on many different committees and commissions and all these kinds of things. And one of those is actually how I ended up getting into education formally, because I had been on the President's Commission for Diversity and at my university, and we were really pushing for changes in admissions practices and pushing for a more diverse student population. And what ended up happening was that a policy that I had helped to write about, we needed to have what did we call it back then? Back then, I think it was a minority admissions recruiter. Eventually, it turned into a lead diversity recruiting role. But we decided that we needed to have that at the university, and it just turned out that as soon as I graduated, that was the year that they decided to actually have that position in place.
Wow.
And so then I ended up taking that position, and that's what I was doing for the first 2 years. And so that, being able to kind of operationalize, I guess, my commitment to this work, it was really great. I got to work in a lot of different schools. I got to make a lot of connections, which is then what turned into my role in K-12 education, because I ended up doing a teacher fellowship or teacher residency program. And so I went from working with high schoolers to working with first graders, which was its own special journey in itself. But it was also really great. And I think when we get down to it, what ended up happening was I was working at a school, and the school there were so many good things that were happening there. It was a charter school that really cared a lot about teacher leadership. It was intentionally diverse. It was just a really great community. And I remember we were having some growing pains, is what I'll say. And then we were talking to the school board and asking the school board, what can we do about this? How can we fix these issues? What are we going to do? And I always remember sitting at one of those meetings And I remember asking the board, like, who's running the school? Like, who's managing this? And the reality is that the board wasn't running a school, but that's because it's not the board's job to run the school.
Hmm.
It was
Right.
actually the administration's job to run the school. And so that has kind of been a little bit of this journey in figuring out, well, how do we take these policies, take these visions, these ideas, these beliefs, and then put them into practice? Like, how do we make sure that the board is working well with the administration and is working well
Hmm.
with all these different folks to figure out how we do what we can for our students? So,
Yeah. I love the way you frame that too. I mean, one thing that I really, really admire is this putting it in practice. Anything can be written on a piece of paper. We can stand there with opinions. You can put a theory of change out there, but really
mhm,
doing it is, that's the trick. And so you're saying, you talk the talk and walk the walk. And I think that's, really admirable. But also I love how you just framed it, and just to pull it up for the audience, you said to make sure that everyone's, understands what their role is, right? This isn't about who's doing anything wrong. We're trying to help people do better. And I think that's a really important frame. We're here to, it's, you would, how would you expect someone to know the ins and outs if they don't have training, or someone doesn't provide a good orientation and ongoing support? So I really like that frame.
yeah, I think sometimes even if we look at what happens in the media, we often get this everything gets sensationalized. There's a lot of the blame game of like, oh, well, they did this or they should have done this. But the reality is that for a lot of, we can say board members, but even just people in general, people don't know what the proper role of the board is, or even, and we can debate what proper means, but I think that there's a lot of room for growth around
Mhm.
what does it mean to be a school board member? What is the role that a board should play or could play? And like, how do we figure out in our local communities how to make all of that work?
Mhm. So what's the strategy? I mean, you've done a lot of community engagement work, and how is
Mhm.
it that, you connect with the community to really understand sort of what they're thinking, feeling, desiring, and then also build that bridge so that, there's this two-way communication with the board.
I think the reality is that for a lot of people, they're especially community members, they really do want to be heard, and there
Mhm.
is a difference between, symbolic listening. So,
Mhm.
of course, we have public comment, and people can come and they can speak, and people might leave there feeling like, "Oh, well, great, I was heard. They listened to me." But you don't really feel listened to if you give this passionate speech about all these different things, and then the board kind of does the same thing that it was going to do anyway. And people
Mhm.
can sometimes leave those kind of environments feeling pretty just disillusioned with the whole process.
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
what the biggest thing that I've learned, and this is, personally, this is professionally, is really making sure that we're leaning into this idea that everybody has something to offer. Even the folks that are coming to the board meeting and they might be screaming and they might be yelling and there's all these different things happening, those folks still have experiences and their experiences
Mhm.
do matter. They still are a
Mhm.
part of our community. And if we can go into it with a sense of not like an us versus them, or we have to, guard against all these different people coming into our community, we can really just think about, okay, well, here's what I'm hearing from all these different places, and what's the appropriate place for us to figure out how to bring all of those voices together to then
Mhm.
make decisions. So
Mhm.
it's really about making sure that we're honoring everybody's experiences. That doesn't mean that we have to do what everybody says to do, but it
Mhm.
does mean that their experiences and their input can inform the work that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. It's beautiful, and I think, it's not even about consensus. It's really just having a space, a safe space to be heard and to
Mhm.
share what someone's own experience has been.
Yeah.
And I would agree. And then this statement isn't a critique on the public comment process. That's not what it's intended to be. But I think anytime that the setup is where one person presents their idea and there's not a response,
Mhm.
it's just designed for me to just put it out there, and then there's no feedback. I think, you use the word disillusioned. I What comes to mind for me, and what I think the feeling that I get in those instances, because it's not just in meetings, it happens like in life when people just, there's just no response. You said something,
Exactly.
you kind of feel invisible,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, am I really here? Does this matter? And when you're talking about people bringing their lived experience to the table, that is really, it's tangible, right? It's
Yeah.
real, and I'm really here. And
Yeah.
I think that's great.
And I think even with some of the board members that I've worked with, I can remember one study where there was a board member we were talking about the public comment process and just like what it actually felt like. And even from the board side, they're people too. Sometimes we don't think that, it's like, well, they're elected officials and it's their job to listen to us. And it is, but all of that does also weigh on them. And so that board
Sure.
member was explaining that sometimes, she valued the public comment process.
Mhm.
She thought that it was really great. And that sometimes it can just feel like what was her exact wording? It felt like a never ending line of 1-star Amazon reviews. And like, that's not fun.
Mm,
Nobody wants to
right.
listen to that. But again,
Sure.
that is kind of your job. And
Yeah.
how do we take what you're learning from people and then
Mhm.
actually use that to move us forward?
So this was some of the work back in Los Angeles, and I don't know if we want to touch on the new research study that you did, but does it also involve sort of this getting your finger on the pulse of the community and then building this space and
In
making it
some
kind of stick?
Yeah, yeah, in some ways. So that project was actually a different one. That one was up in Pacific Northwest, but the Los Angeles work, that work has really been interesting because we have started to try to figure out just what is it that board members are dealing with? How are they negotiating all these different constraints? Sometimes there are legal constraints about here's how we can respond in these spaces, or here's how we can't.
Mhm.
Or there are sometimes, political constraints where you might want to say something, but you know that if you say
Mhm.
something, it might go viral on social media, and how is that going to impact any kind of like reelection or anything like that? Or in California, um, it's a wonderful state for so many different reasons, but there are oftentimes recalls, and it doesn't take much to have a recall election to happen, and people can
Mhm.
mobilize against you, and that can be a traumatizing experience for a lot of people. And so I think it's what we know now is that board members are dealing with an environment that many never thought that they would have to deal with. Board meetings used to be
Right.
boring. They used to be where
Yeah.
you go there and they go through their list, go through the agenda, they vote, everything just kind of works, and you can be out within an hour and a half. Now we have board meetings that they might go for 4 hours, 5 hours. I've been
Right.
in board meetings where we were in there until 1 a.m. and that is
Mhm.
just kind of the norm now for a lot of communities.
Yeah, it's an interesting point too because it's not in Delaware, not a compensated role,
Exactly.
and so to ask people, to be exposed to this endless 1-star Amazon rating, like no matter what you do, somebody's unhappy.
Right.
And then they're long hours, it's a lot of work, and there's no that it's like a job, but it's not, you're not even getting the
Mhm.
recognition that it is a job. Do you think that like professional development can help board members be be more comfortable or be more effective or in fare better personally, emotionally, decision making?
I think that's a yes and question. So,
Hmm.
yes, more professional development, I think, would be beneficial. And that's something that we're hearing from board members in all of our research, really all across the country. One of the things that has come up oftentimes is that the training that board members get, they get training on the legal kind of constraints. They get training on passing a budget. They get training on building a relationship with superintendents, and all that's fair and necessary, and that makes perfect sense. But we're also realizing that board members are having to deal with lots of different other issues that they weren't always having to deal with before. So now, and let's, if we can get into more of a political lens, board members now are oftentimes expected to make statements on like national political issues. And so it's not just about, oh, do we want to pass this bond that's going to help pay for us building a new high school? But it's, what do you think about immigration raids and
Hmm.
protests that are happening? What do you think about the wars in the Middle East? What do you think about climate change? Like, these are the kinds of issues that board members are having to figure out. And also, they're not really getting a lot of training around how do you even manage crowds. I've sat on, because when these big issues come up, people are coming to board meetings. It's like, logistically, it is a very difficult thing to try to navigate all of that. But there
Sure.
isn't really a lot of training on how to manage all of that and then keep things going. Because at the end of the day, yes, all of that is very important, but boards also have to pass a budget. They also
Hmm.
have to do some of these like actual like things that keeps sometimes that yes, the board can be responsive to a lot of community concerns, but the board
Hmm.
also has to make sure that the lights stay on. The board also has to make sure that when kids are trying to go to school, that the bus is going to be able to run. That, like, those are the kinds of things that also matter.
Yep. And in terms of the board navigating, because all of those things you said are true, how does the board really understand, kind of going back to what we talked about a little earlier, their role
Mhm.
vis-a-vis the superintendent, right, and the district, so they do have this real authority and responsibility to make decisions about budgets and allocations and things that affect teaching and learning. And then there are people who are sort of doing the day-to-day work.
Mhm.
Do you think training around sort of differentiating those two those two components, but then really knowing what is your job when you're looking at the budget? What are they asking
Yeah.
you to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the I'm thinking back to a board member from a study a few years ago where she was talking about how she wishes she had a T-shirt that she could wear all the time that said like "We're all about policy, not about operations," because that was her focus. Because the
Uh-huh.
board's role, in many ways, is oversight and policy and
Mhm.
accountability. That's where the
Mhm.
board can really be the most impactful. I think what we have started to see, and especially you started to see it in once a lot of the protests were happening in 2020 and 2021, school reopenings, all those kinds of things, that there were some board members that did get elected or get appointed that had more of an operations kind of lens, and they saw themselves as, we're coming here to make a difference. And it's, again, perfectly fine to come in with an appetite for change and really wanting to understand how do we like move the needle for kids, and like all of that matters. But thinking about like what's the lane that and the approach that you take? Do you take that
Right.
from, I'm going to go into a school and I'm going to be monitoring what's happening in that school, or is it more of, here's some policy ideas that we have. Let's actually talk about them as a board. Let's have more community input. Let's see
Yeah.
what we can do to make sure that we understand what people need, and then
Mhm.
use our policy lens to do that. But I
Mhm.
think that kind of training and differentiating what is
Yeah.
operations and what is policy, those two, that
Mhm.
could really matter.
Mhm. And they get kind of pulled in different directions depending on
That's
who's
right.
asking. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about I agree with you with the policy making. It's a good it's a it's a nice place to put our attention. And I want to link it back to this community participation.
Mhm.
What are some ideas you have about how communities can participate in and inform and shape what board policy winds up being?
So this is one where I've thought about it a lot because it's oftentimes people, and this is board members, this is also community members, they do see the board meeting itself as the main place for you to be able to get your voice across, get your point across. They think of that as a place for community engagement. And I'm not, at this point, having gone to so many board meetings, I don't know if I'm convinced that that's really what the board meeting is for, or whether that's the best venue for it.
Hmm.
Some of the research that we've done, we've heard that there are a lot of other ways that people can actually get community engagement um, done in ways that I think are more relational, and they're not just checking a box. So there are some board members that talk about having coffee chats or things like that, where they actually go out into the community and they just sit and they learn and they hear more about what people are thinking and feeling. There's some board members that really focus more on the policy committee meetings because in a standard like regular board meeting there are a lot more rules and things that there are guidelines that you have to go by. But in some of these more like workshop sessions that you can have in policy committee meetings or things like that, those meetings are spaces where people can actually be much more, they can be more of a dialogue, and I think that matters more than just being able to either submit public comment or submit written testimony or
Hmm.
things like that. And then I think maybe one more thing that might be important is that there's several boards that have tried to do this, where they actually take the board kind of like on the road. So that main meeting that they do, they might actually have that meeting instead of it being in the district office. They go to a school site, or they might go out into the
Hmm.
community, so that you're bringing the board to the community versus always asking the community to come to the board meeting.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's really important in a place like Delaware because as you know, and our listeners know, we have a lot of choice, and the districts are um, not contiguous. Like you have schools that there's sort of it's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle, and there are a lot of different opinions on that. The thing that I always remember most personally is when I worked at AI Middle. It was very far from the homes of some of the students. And if something had happened during the day, it wasn't always possible for a parent to be able to get there, So
Yeah.
like it really does matter. And bringing the conversation to the community. We were gonna, we offered for the every year for newly elected board members. We offer them a grant if they want to have this coffee
Hmm.
conversation thing, or they want to have pizza, or they want to, whatever, just
Right.
find a space, but, make things comfortable and come in and listen to people. And I do think that that's important because the actual board meeting isn't really where, the rules sort of preclude that two-way conversation is going to be able to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think this actually gets back to a point that you were making earlier. We were discussing about just the uncompensated nature of being on a board. This gets at kind of this idea of who's actually able to do this work. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you have to go and run coffee sessions, or you have to also do your board meeting, your
Yeah.
regular board meeting, you have to prep for that. You have to do all these different things. It's not a full-time job, but essentially it
Mm-hmm.
is. And
Mm-hmm.
so who has the capacity to basically work two full-time jobs? Some board members are retired and that works and they have a little bit more flexibility. But we're also seeing a lot of board members get elected who aren't. They're full-time employees, or they have other things going on. Or even if you have families, it's very difficult to be able to
Mm-hmm.
manage all of this. So I think there's, on the one hand, more training is important, and we do need to make sure there's more professional learning and development. But I also always wonder if there's an opportunity for us to really consider what kind of structural things we need to put in place to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that people can actually serve, and what kind of resources we need to
Mm-hmm.
be able to do that. Because if you've got,
Mm-hmm.
you have like a district like Los Angeles Unified, and
Mm-hmm.
very few districts are like that. It is a very large district. There's so many students, so many educators, but their board is one of the few in the country that's actually compensated. It is
Mm-hmm.
a full-time job. But beyond that, they also have, a district infrastructure to support them. They have
Sure.
staffers and everybody, and every district can't do that. Financially, it's just not possible. But I'm wondering if there are lessons that we might be able to learn about if you want people to be these more community engaged, community connected board members.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? What do we need to have in place to
Mm-hmm.
ensure that that's actually a possibility?
Yeah, and I think it's an issue of equity, and it's an issue of access and whose voices, because if voices, aren't there's a system or a structure that's preventing certain voices from being part of the conversation, then that's oppressive by design, right? And so then
Right.
you won't have a school system that actually reflects the needs or
Hmm.
the desires of the people that it's there to serve,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's important. Um, Another related question, though. So when we have this kind of, it came up when I was thinking when you were talking. It's an issue really of social justice,
Right.
and I had Dr. Kimyana Burke on my program, and she talked about literacy
Hmm.
as an issue of social justice. And so, I to me it makes perfect sense. You're denying people, the opportunity to fully participate in life, and it has implications, across the board. I sort of feel the same way about, sort of school boards and how accessible they are and how much communities can participate. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we actually made a lot of really good strides toward this, and I feel like this has changed. We have this conversation a lot in education.
Mm-hmm.
The pandemic was horrendous for many different reasons. So many people died. There were, economic losses. There were all these different things. But what it also forced us to do was to think outside the box. We had to figure out, well, how do we have to have these meetings. We have to, have public participation. What does that look like? And so a lot of boards did transition into having more hybrid or like online meetings. But then you started to get into maybe like 2021, early 2022. A lot of that started to shift for some boards. They started to go back to how things had always been done because people said, "Oh, we want to get back to normal." And I think this idea of getting back to normal, I understand the rationale behind it. I understand what we were trying to do, but I think that it also, cut off a lot of people from being able to access board meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was actually really great where if you were having a board meeting, you could have people log on, they could be making dinner, they could be driving home from work, they could be doing all these different things and still be a part of their,
Mm-hmm.
local decision-making
Mm-hmm.
process. So I think getting back to more of that is something that we definitely want to think about, and then consider even for people who are coming fit in person to some of these meetings. helping them understand just the structure. What does it look like? Why am I like,
Hmm.
we use so many acronyms in education, and
Yeah.
we're throwing around so many different things, or even trying to understand, well, what is a consent agenda, or
Right.
what is like all these things, they're just not common
Right.
phrases. And so
Yeah.
helping people understand kind of the language of boards and the language of
Hmm.
governance, and like what does that
Hmm.
look like, and how do you use that in some ways to also be able to influence decision making.
Hmm. Yeah, that's it's a great point. I mean, you can't fully participate if you don't know what's going on. And in Delaware, you know this, and for the audience, those recently signed into law bills by Governor Meyer that do um, require, but I mean, it's required because it's a law, but to me, it's prioritizing it.
Mhm,
It's saying that this is important, which is more to me more important than a requirement. You comply with the requirement, but you have the spirit of
mhm,
engaging people, and so there is, now districts are required to provide a Zoom link so that people can
mhm,
participate. Because if the circumstances of my life don't allow me to, it doesn't mean that I should be precluded from having a voice.
mhm.
And I
And then
think that's important.
the reality is sometimes, again, I've talked about these long board meetings. You might have people who they can be available from 7 to 8:30, but the topic that they want to talk about, it might happen either later. Like, so having
Right.
access to everything. Of course, you always have to have your agenda posted before anyway.
Hmm.
But making sure that people know how to even read that and understand.
Yeah.
Okay, if I'm going to give public comment, it's going to be at this time with
Right.
on this particular agenda item, and I can plan my life around that versus having to
Right.
drive to the district office, stay there from 5:30 until whenever
Right.
it might come up. It gives us the ability to live our lives in a flexible way
Yeah.
and still have our voice matter,
Yep.
um, in these
Yeah,
spaces.
amazing work. I am so proud that our of to know that you do this work, and that you're continuing to do it as a researcher, as a practitioner. I didn't mention I mentioned it earlier in the opening, but we haven't talked about it. I would love for you, if you don't mind, just share a little bit with your the new report that's being released, and sort of what are the big takeaways there.
Yeah, I'm so excited about that report. It's been one of those people talk about some of the work being like a labor of love. It has definitely been that. We started this project back in, I believe, we are again. This was a collaboration between multiple institutions. So I previously was at the University of Southern California, and then there was another colleague who is at the University of Alabama, and then I'm here at UD. And so we've been working together for the last couple of years, really trying to understand all the different challenges that several of these board members based in California have been facing. We know that we have this idea that school boards are these spaces of local democracy. They're spaces for us to really engage with each other about these big ideas. But board members aren't always in how to do that. Board members aren't always there's just not always a lot of opportunities for us to really understand what they're going through on a day-to-day basis. We hear about what's happening in the media, and that's great, but we also want to hear about directly from them. What are the things that they're dealing with? How do they understand their role? How do they understand the role of the board? And then if there are any strategies that they're using to be able to overcome some of these issues.
Hmm.
So all of that it came to a pretty lengthy report. At this point, it's about 60 pages, but there's so much good that's in there. I
Hmm.
think high level, from this idea of like what's the role of the board member,
Hmm.
we found that board members could be categorized in like four different ways. So we have them categorized as like either a change maker, or a
Hmm.
champion, or a rule follower, or a representative. And I think
Hmm.
one of the pieces that's important for that typology is that there's board members aren't just one of those things. They might be all of those things combined, and maybe one is more salient than the other, just depending on the day. So you can imagine that most board members are going to feel like they're representatives, but they might be representatives of very different groups. Some folks see themselves as like representatives of like taxpayers. Some are more focused on students. Some are more focused on marginalized folks, and it really just kind of depends. But then you also have some of those board members that see themselves as change makers, and change makers can go in multiple directions. They could go to the direction of change makers, like you might see somebody similar to like the Moms for Liberty kind of change makers, or they might be somebody on the opposite end of the spectrum that's much more about equity and justice and those kinds of things. So, and in the role, that was one of the big things that came out. And then we had these 7 challenges that we also found, and those most of those I would say are fairly common challenges, things that we've seen before. So board members need to navigate these complex relationships. Earlier, you and I were talking about how much time it takes in order
Mm-hmm.
to be a board member. So the burden of time came up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Training and capacity; those things were pretty important as well. But there were a few that we think are somewhat unique, and I think they're really some of the ones that I would like to highlight here.
Sure.
One, board members really were trying to figure out how to use data, and not
Mm-hmm.
just data, that they're being given by like their district leaders, but really trying to understand for themselves how do they, really know what's happening with their students. Test scores matter. We know that test scores matter. They're really important, but there are other data points that also matter, and board members are trying to figure out how to work with those and really understand how they can use data to drive a lot of the change that they wanted to actually see.
Mm-hmm.
We also saw this idea of shifting technologies. So I just talked a little bit about how we have Zoom or like we have hybrid meetings, we have virtual meetings, all of those kind of things that are happening. But board members are also dealing with new social media kinds of things. And that's another opportunity for community engagement, but there's not really any training around that. We're
Mm-hmm.
not really helping people figure out, well, how do you actually manage like a Facebook group? Should you be
Mm-hmm.
managing a Facebook group? Or even if you have your own personal social media accounts, what does it mean to figure out the
Mm-hmm.
rules and the guidelines around that? Because,
Mm-hmm.
that's your personal page, but also once you start talking on behalf of the district, well,
Sure.
it's not personal anymore. So what does that
Mm-hmm.
really look like? So some of those things were some of the big ones. And then we talked a little bit about the policy constraints. And this is
Mm-hmm.
all based in California, but some of these definitely are constraints that people have across the board. We've talked
Yeah.
about, these issues with public meeting requirements and people understanding like what that
Mm-hmm.
looks like. Some boards have like their complicated issues between whether you're elected at large or whether you're elected by a trustee area. So some
Mm-hmm.
of those kind of tensions also came about in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what does it look like for you to represent a very
Mm-hmm.
small like niche community versus you representing the entire district. So
Yeah.
lots of stuff in there. Like I said, it's about 60 pages, but a lot of really good things to think about in terms of how do we best support school board members in being able to do this work of overseeing districts, managing this, and making sure that students are getting what they need at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. Amazing. Congratulations again on the report, on your work. I think these models uh, for personas, so to speak, it gives us language that allows us to demystify and kind of handle better
Hmm.
this note board member, right? It's like, so it could be anything. And now you've given us sort of 4 roles that I think are really, really valuable, and then called out these challenges or opportunities. And I'm hopeful that we'll find other ways to collaborate in the future, because First Aid Educate would like to sort of dig in on these and really show in Delaware how, again, on the national scene, we're taking models that work and looking and implementing on the ground, and then producing things that actually drive real change. But none of that would be possible if it wasn't for you and this amazing work that you're doing. So,
Thank you.
again, thank you so much. For our listeners, thank you for joining us. This is another episode of Leading Together. I would love for you to check out our Knowledge Hub. There are additional resources, particularly on the data driven decision making piece, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.